Galen
How are
is
you?
here.
Are you in London?
No, we're in London.
Hi, Galen.
We
Oh, right.
yeah, we flew over during our spring break, maybe being a bit naughty, but
That's,
we were doing all of our teaching online. So we just finished our semester.
I think Galen, you're also muted.
We are live, by the way.
I wanted to say hello. I'm not sure we've been properly we did meet years ago when I was a BPhil student, and we've been in correspondence with via Philip Goff recently with this SES volume. But
yes,
anyway,
that wasn't when I was still at Oxford, was it? Can't be.
It was when Ned Block was giving the John Locke lectures, and I was giving him a hard time over interpretations of.
I remember.
Yeah.
Hi, Galen.
Hi. How are you?
Good, thank you. How are you?
I thought I'll talk to you some other time.
Okay.
Rob.
I am just circulating the live stream link, and we will wait a few more minutes.
Well, I can use this as the time to announce my own thingy. Yeah. So just for those who are regularly attending and are coming next week. So next week, I cheekily put myself on the bill. So it's my talk next week, and I will somewhat unusually, I'll circulate a paper in advance for those who want to look at it. There's no requirement to do so. There will be a talk as usual, but on Friday I will send around a draft of it. And it's not, Anita, it's not the paper from the other week.
It's not the paper we just heard. Okay.
No.
Yeah.
I wouldn't do that to you.
I will likely send it around with the link for next week. By the way, did people get the handout for today's session? Okay. If there is any need for it, I can upload it on the chat.
I just have to disappear for half a second.
Okay.
Michelle and Galen.
Hi, Jenny.
Hi.
How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good.
Is it a real background in your house?
Yeah, it's our I guess sitting room. Oh, the doorbell rang. Sorry, hold on.
I'm not in the same room. Oh, you go. Okay.
Galen.
Yeah, where are you?
I'm in Abu Dhabi.
Oh, yes.
Where are you?
Hmm?
Are you in the UK or
Yes.
Texas?
I'm in the UK.
You're in the UK.
I'm in Kentish Town. I think like David Papineau.
I took David for dinner in Kentish Townish, that kind of area, Primrose Hill, not so long ago.
I'm in Essex. I'm on the coast.
You think? Oh, you are? Oh, you're not in Kentish Town. Okay.
No, but I'll be in Kentish Town tomorrow.
How did tennis go, David?
Tennis was fine.
Sorry about that. It's the sort of hazard of working from home, I guess.
You've got a lot of books, haven't you?
I know. Do you want some?
You've got a lot of books if you're in different rooms. They're not the same books.
No.
It looks like a library.
Yeah, it does. It does.
I built the one downstairs.
Galen is living on the attic.
I keep it in the attic.
I've been told that there's a Netflix show about a woman who tells you how to clean your house and keep it tidy and live a tidy, clean life. And her rule is to keep no more than 10 books or something like this. And I remember thinking, it's not going to happen. I just looked at my own bookshelf, hundreds of books, and I just thought, if that's the correct way to live, then I'm happy to live in the incorrect way.
Yeah.
She has other good tips though, like keeping shoe boxes within drawers, so the socks going on, and that's very clever.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But I'm not happy with the book rule.
Yeah, that seems you can't follow that rule if you work with books. It just doesn't make sense.
But anything you haven't worn or used in the last 8 months, you throw out. That seems sensible too. I think otherwise clutter develops.
But you have certain clothes that you only wear to certain events, so that I mean, those events may only come up
Goodness me, actually, yeah. See, so Netflix should have consulted a board of philosophers really before putting the show on.
Is it Marie Kondomori?
Sorry?
Yeah.
Is it Kondomori? Yeah. You know,
Yeah,
she's a panpsychist, of course.
Of course she is. Speaking of
Right.
which, words for the
Because when you get rid of all your stuff, you need to, you properly say goodbye to it. And she believes all her things have souls.
Oh wow! So she's sort of even more radically panpsychist than
We can invite
Yeah.
her to the series next time.
Yeah, only if she helps me tidy my flat afterwards. Because that's
I
the
don't know
job.
the series, but I know the books.
I see.
Yeah.
Should we? Are you ready to go, Michelle?
Yeah.
I have to again. Just you're chairing. It's fine.
I'm chairing. Yeah.
Stop my video for a second.
Okay. Cool. I'll mute you as well, just in case.
Yeah.
Hi everyone. Thanks for coming to our 5th meeting this term. We have Michelle Montague from Texas this week, and she'll be talking to us about rethinking the attitudes. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for inviting me. Yeah, so in this paper, so I provided a handout, but I don't like sharing my screen because I like to see faces, as many faces as possible. So hopefully you can just follow along with it if you have it. So in this paper, I'm concerned with intentionality, and I just define that very widely as the property of being about something or of something. And standard examples of intentional states are beliefs, thoughts, hopes, desires, wonderings, supposing, fears. And the orthodox metaphysical picture of how to treat these intentional states is what I'm going to call the tripartite view. And the reason I call it that is because it analyzes intentional states in terms of 1, the subject, 2, the content of the subject's mental state, and 3, the subject's attitude to the content, the attitude that makes the mental state the particular kind of mental state it is, whether it's a belief, a want, or a fear. And the attitude content distinction is standardly taken to be sharp. The attitude is no part of the content. And on the tripartite view that I'm concerned with today, the attitude is treated as a relation of the subject to the content, and so can't be part of the content. So I have a metaphysical concern with this orthodox picture. Does the correct or best description of the metaphysical nature of an intentional mental state distinguish 3 elements in this way? In other words, should it treat the attitude content distinction as sharp in this way? The central idea behind the tripartite view is that the attitude and content are different kinds of things. You can think of Schiffer's talk of belief boxes and desire boxes, and you sort of have this really vivid illustration of content moving from one box to the next box. And that's what I'm calling the tripartite view. So on your handout, suppose Jane is now thinking or judging or supposing that Fido, the dog, is in the field. According to the tripartite view, this mental episode has the structure RAB, where A and B are names for things and R is the name of a relation. So you have 1, the subject A, 2, the thing designated by the that clause B, and 3, the thinking relation R in which A stands to be. And you can find typical statements of the tripartite view everywhere. I've just selected 2, one from Fodor and one from Perry. So I'll just read out one of them. Fodor says, propositional attitudes should be analyzed as relations. In particular, the verb in a sentence like John believes it's raining expresses a relation between John and something else. And a token of that sentence is true if and only if John stands in the belief relation to that thing. So end quote. And so Fodor was really concerned with attitudes like belief, but the tripartite view has also been applied to perception. Some philosophers think it naturally applies to perceptual experience. So imagine Jane has a visual experience as of grass, analyzed as, the tripartite view would analyze it as RAB. So you have the perceiver, A, you have the thing designated by B, and you have the visual experience relation R, in which A stands to be. And I'll sometimes call it a perceptual attitude or a manner of representation. So just to sort of solidify what I've said so far, using P as a name for a proposition and O as the name for an object, one can use formula of the following simple kind to represent the tripartite picture of the metaphysical situation. So 1A believes that P, so you have, A, the little subject A, standing in the belief relation to a proposition P. Desire is analyzed as a relation in which the subject stands to the proposition. And then perceptual experiences, whether they're visual or auditory or whatever, are analyzed as a subject standing in the visual relation to an object or an auditory relation to an object. Now I say, let's abandon the tripartite view. We do not need to commit ourselves to the existence of hundreds of intentional attitude relation types conceived of as metaphysically distinguishable from intentional contents. The differences between intentional states that are standardly captured by appeal to attitude relations can equally well be captured by differences between their contents. So that's sort of the argumentative strategy of today, and I'm going to argue for something called the dual view. And according to the dual view, all there is to the metaphysics of our intentional states is 1, a subject, and 2, a content. So there's no need to postulate distinct metaphysical relations and call them the belief relation, the desire relation, and so forth. So the dual view with its 2 elements may be represented as follow on your handout. Number 4, A's having a content C is just represented as CA on your handout. Now, there are a lot of metaphysical questions to ask about the structure of CA. And 2 of the, 2 questions that I'm concerned with is whether or not to treat CA in an internalist way, and that's the conception I have. I have an internalist conception of CA such that any mental content that A has can be shared with her twin or her perfect twin, her twin on perfect twin Earth, although they have different causal relations, obviously. Another question, which is sort of deep in my heart, but I don't really address here because I don't have to, but it's in the background for me. And that question is whether one must interpret the CA in a standard metaphysical way as representing an item of one particular metaphysical kind, an object or a particular, as possessing or exemplifying an item of another fundamentally different metaphysical kind, a property or a universal. I don't think so. I don't think that we have to treat CA as having that kind of metaphysical structure. It could be that the final metaphysics of CA could be expressed by something like a certain portion of textured stuff. And that's a sort of, I'm just gesturing at something, but you might think about, to get a handle on what I'm thinking of here, is you might think about P.F. Strawson's feature placing in individuals as kind of the kind of metaphysics I have in mind. But I'm going to put that to the side for this paper, and I'm just going to treat CA in a simple object property way. So the key idea of the dual view can be expressed at, putting both of those issues I just mentioned to the side. And what it says, again, is that in being in an intentional state, the subject is simply in a complex, contentful state rather than being related to something else, a content. One can, in the case of any intentional state, specify its content in such a way that the intentional attitude that it involves can be inferred from the content specification, although the content specification makes no references to attitudes. Now, according to the dual view that I'm going to defend here, you ought to be able to look at the content that's displayed by some specification of a state and identify what state is in question just by looking at the content. So that's the view that I'm going to defend and that I prefer. And just as sort of an interlude, for those of us that are unwilling to give up the general conception of things, according to which what we have is a subject being related to a content, I'll propose a less disruptive kind of tripartite view, a revised tripartite view that I'll call the or tripartite view. So the idea behind this or tripartite view is to get rid of the original metaphysical plethora of attitude relations, such as beliefs and desires and perceptual attitudes, and replace them with one or intentional relation represented by the I structure on your handout. And that indicates a relation to a very fine-grained content, one that builds in the differences between believing and wanting. So instead of having all kinds of propositional attitude relations, such as B and D, believing and desiring and wondering and contemplating, rather you have the structure that's illustrated in 5 that says A has content, A has C as an intentional content, and what you have is the subject being related to some content with this or intentional attitude. And then the content will have to be specified fine-grained enough in order to identify which intentional state is in question. So I think the central difference between the dual and the or tripartite view turns wholly on the question of relationality. So most relational theories of intentionality construe intentional relations as relating independently existing items. So common varieties of internalism and externalism analyze intentional relations as involving relations between the subject and objects and properties, whether those properties are concretely instantiated or uninstantiated. So you can find examples of this kind of view everywhere. I think there's an alternative and a better view of relations, according to which the or tripartite view just collapses into the dual view. And just to give you a flavor of what I have in mind, consider a view of intentionality that you can call Brentinian, after Franz Brentano. Can you see Franz Brentano, the bear in the back? You can't see it in the back. So while it seems clear that any viable conception of intentionality must be relational in some sense, it does not follow that one must always suppose that a relation relates to fully independently existing items. So on this view, the so-called object of intentionality does not exist independently of the subject. And I have something more widespread in mind besides my hand, right? That you might think that's not independent of me, but I can think of it. Now, this view, this Brentinian view, encapsulates all objects of intentionality. So according to Brentano, all of what he calls physical phenomena, shape, color, size, those are all appearances. They're mental items in our present day sense, and they result from our causal interactions with a reality as it is in itself. So on his view, on Brentano's view, it is the physical phenomena, which again are mental phenomena in our present day sense, that are the objects of intentionality, not the reality as it is in itself. Now, this view, I think, can still be called relational because it accepts some of the other features that are characteristic or definitive of a relation. A relation is something that connects something that essentially has two or more slots that must be filled. However, it doesn't say or imply that what fills those slots must be metaphysically independent items. So that's just sort of another metaphysical plug that's working in my mind when I'm thinking about these issues. But for my purposes today, whether or not one prefers the dual view as I do, or something like the or tripartite view, or sees them as one, the central point of today is the rejection of the standard tripartite view. There are no attitudes as commonly construed. So that's sort of all in the way of setup. And so for the rest of the paper, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by listing 6 motivations for the tripartite view. And then I'm going to articulate the dual view for perception. And then I'll articulate the dual view for thoughts, beliefs, desires, wonderings. And then I'll come back to the motivations for the tripartite view and show how the dual view addresses those. Okay, so drink of water. So the first motivation, which I think is a favorite, is that the attitude element and the content element of intentional states appear to be modally independent. So it appears that you can believe that P, believe that Q, and believe that R. So you've got the proposition changing and you're holding the attitude fixed. And it also appears that you can change the attitude and hold the content fixed. So you get hope that P, believe that P, fear that P. Okay, so that's the first motivation. The second motivation is that there are certain intuitively valid inferences that the tripartite view can easily capture. So there are 2 examples that I give on the handout. Stacy believes that the earth is round. George believes that the earth is round. So Stacy believes exactly what George believes. Stacy believes world peace to be achievable. George wants world peace to be achievable. Stacy believes exactly what George wants. So if you can hold, if you can have, sort of hold the content fixed, you can see why these inferences are valid. The third motivation is that we love to appeal to folk psychology. We use it in explaining and predicting the behavior of others. And the attitude content distinction seems to play a pivotal role in these explanations, in part by featuring in patterns of inference similar to those mentioned in motivation 2. So we might, for example, use the following syllogism to explain George's beer-seeking behavior. George believes that there is beer in the fridge. George wants to have a beer, so George opens the fridge. A fourth motivation is that different intentional attitudes seem to have distinct causal functional profiles. So if you imagine mapping out our mental economy and the causal structure, it seems that you'll be able to isolate different attitudes by pointing to their different causal roles in that overall mental economy. Fifth motivation is that different intentional states appear to have different directions of fit, depending on their conditions of satisfaction. So beliefs, for example, have truth conditions for the conditions of satisfaction, and you want your mind to match the world. So beliefs have a mind to world direction of fit, whereas desires, you want to get the world to match your mind. So desires have a world to mind direction of fit. So the idea is that you need to have attitudes like this because we have these different ways of relating to the world, and postulating attitudes captures those. A kind of related motivation is motivation 6, and it says that according to it, some philosophers think that intentional states have correctness or fittingness or appropriateness conditions. And the fundamental idea seems to be that intentional states can be assessed as appropriate or fitting in light of the way the world is, and determining appropriate conditions requires distinguishing between attitudes and content. So, for example, belief has truth or falsity as appropriateness conditions, or truth as appropriateness conditions, but that won't work for something like fear. So you need to have a different set of appropriateness conditions. And so fear would be fitting if there was danger, for example. So I don't know if I think that there are these appropriateness conditions, but I can see how that might motivate one to think we need to make an attitude content distinction. Okay, so those are the 6 motivations that I've come up with for making this distinction. Now, up until this point, I have stayed very neutral on whether I'm talking about conscious states or not. And now that I'm going to present to you the dual view for perception, I am going to focus on conscious perceptual states, and in particular, conscious perceptual experiences. And the reason is that in the context of this debate, manners of representation were introduced in the context of discussing the relationship between the intentionality and the phenomenology of perceptual states. And I think that we need to think about the way that intentionality and phenomenology is related with respect to perception to see why it is we actually don't need to postulate manners of representation or perceptual attitudes in order to account for our perceptual experiences. So again, according to the tripartite view, perceptual experience is partly constituted by a perceptual attitude or a manner of representation, which is construed as a relation to a content. Thus, we are told that there's a visual manner of representation, an auditory manner of representation, a gustatory manner of representation, and so on for each distinctive type of perceptual relation between a subject and a content. So the goal of the dual view is to show that it's unnecessary to posit these metaphysically distinct perceptual manners of representation construed as relations to content. All that is needed is a subject and an intentional content where this has the general form CA. So first, consider how different perceptual experiences may be represented with the general form CA. So on your handout, there's number 6, a visual experience as of a red round ball. So in the CA general form, we have a subject A, and then we have the content spelled out red round object. For an auditory experience of a quiet clarinet, middle C, we have the subject A, and then the content spelled out middle C, clarinet-ish, quiet, and so on for tactile experience. Now, it seems the content of these experiences is enough to distinguish between them. And I'm going to argue that such content differences are adequate to capture all of the relevant differences between perceptual experiences. And the way to show how to do that is to consider the relationship between intentionality and phenomenology in perceptual experience. So consider again a subject's having a visual experience as of a red round ball. This experience has certain phenomenological and intentional features. So P, phenomenological features, I'm just understanding that to mean what it's like to see red or round, and phenomenological properties are properties of experience. Predicates attributing phenomenological properties characterize what it is like for the subject to have the experience, given the properties the experience has. We also have intentional features, and I'm taking those as attributions of properties that are made by the subject simply in having the visual experience as they do. Property attributions that are, as I say, made in experience. So I take the properties attributed simply in having a perceptual experience, redness and roundness, to be part of the intentional content of the experience. So elucidating the relationship between P and I, label P and I on your handout, should help to make it clear why there is no irreducible distinction between manners of representation and contents for perceptual experience. So in having a visual experience as of a red round ball, a certain fundamental kind of intentional content can be read off its phenomenology. A color property is attributed to something, and the presence of the color phenomenology suffices for, indeed constitutes, the subject's making this property attribution. Put in another way, it is simply in virtue of a visual experiences having the color phenomenology it has that the color attribution that is made is made. And again, a visual experience as of a red round ball, which instantiates the what it's like to see red phenomenological character, ipso facto involves the attribution of a certain color property to the real or seemingly real ball. In attributing such a color property, I attribute the property I take to be immediately revealed in experience. I attribute the property whose essential intrinsic character I take to be wholly revealed simply in the phenomenological character of experience. So that's just to demonstrate how it works for one property in the case of visual experience. And the hope is that we can generalize from the visual case of color, first to all phenomenological properties that may characterize visual experience, and second to all conscious perceptual experiences. So then you get a general claim like, in the case of any perceptual experience, it has at least a crucial part of the intentional content it has because, and only because, it has the phenomenological character it has. So the payoff then is that the differences and similarities between the perceptual experiences that are a present concern are wholly adequately described simply by reference to phenomenological properties and the intentional properties that are determined by them. So we don't need to appeal to a specific perceptual attitude relation as a further factor in our account of the nature of experience. The most one could mean by visual attitude, for example, is that all visual experiences share a certain kind of distinctive phenomenology, what it's like to see color and shape. The most one could mean by auditory attitude is that all auditory experiences share a certain kind of distinctive phenomenology, sound phenomenology, and so on. These high-level descriptions of what experiences in particular sensory modalities have in common, phenomenologically speaking, do not, however, lead to any further metaphysical relation picked out by the terms attitude or manner of representation. All we have is the subject and the content, and that is the phenomenological content and the intentional content, that it is what it is in virtue of the phenomenological content. And that's all we have. That's all we need. So that's the general strategy for how to distinguish between all the perceptual experiences by looking at the fine-grained content. You get that fine-grained content by looking at the phenomenology of the perceptual experiences. And that phenomenology determines property attributions that we make in experience. And once we have all that, we don't need to talk about a manner of representation. We've said everything we need to say about the state. Okay, so that's the pitch for perception. And rather than sort of considering objections that people might have, I'm just gonna let those come up in question period and move on to how I think that this view should work for beliefs and desires and thoughts and sort of those kinds of attitudes. So for the dual view to succeed, the differences between these states, between beliefs and desires and wonderings and supposings that are traditionally captured by specifying both an attitude relation and a content, must be fully expressed by speaking only of contents and differences in content. So again, the idea is simple. Once the content is fully laid out, it will be clear, as in the case of perceptual experiences, which type of intentional state the subject is in. So what I'm going to do now is take some intentional states and offer some analyses of these intentional states as a way of providing a framework for how I think that this ought to be done. And so the hope is that, you sort of see how this goes, and then there can be discussion about whether this is a hopeful project. But I'm not going to take every single intentional state that exists and analyze it. I'm just going to give you an idea of how I think this should go. So I'll start with belief. When a subject believes something, she accepts that reality is a certain way. Typically, she takes it that there is a certain object that instantiates a property, or that several objects instantiate several properties, or jointly instantiate a relation. So a subject who believes it's now snowing, for example, takes it that the property of falling snow is now instantiated. Since beliefs require the possession and deployment of concepts, in having this belief, the subject deploys the concept snow, the concept falling, the concept now, and the concept instantiation. So substituting in the general form CA, we get, so we have A, the subject, and then in bold capitals, we get the content, snow falling now instantiation. That gives the content. That gives the status of the belief. Now, some people, I'll just mention this, are going to get nervous about the concept instantiation and think, oh no, that's too complicated. How can we possess that? Nobody possesses that. But I have something very non-demanding in mind about what it takes for someone to possess the concept of instantiation. It's just to take it that something exists, that this is so. And I think dogs and babies can do that. So it's very minimal. Now, if we give the content of or analyze belief as in 9, then we can go on to analyze that somebody believes that it's not snowing, and that can be represented in 10. So we get A, the little subject, and then we get snow falling now, non-instantiation. So that's sort of the rough analysis of belief. So now take contemplation. When a subject contemplates snow or the state of affairs of snow falling, there is an absence of taking the property in question as instantiated. Contemplating snow or a state of affairs of snow falling merely involves deploying the concept snow and falling. So again, substituting into the general form CA, we get 11, we get the subject, and then we just get snow falling. Moving on to the intentional state of wondering, a subject may wonder whether or not it's now snowing. And this is different from believing that it's snowing, because the content of wondering whether it's snowing involves the entertaining of the possibility of a property being instantiated, rather than taking it that that property is instantiated. So substituting into the general form CA, we get 12, snow falling now, possibility of instantiation. However, the case of wondering is complicated for a number of reasons. And one complication concerns how to distinguish wondering about the possibility of snow falling now from merely contemplating the possibility of snow falling now. And I think the significant difference between these two intentional states is that in the case of wondering, the subject is concerned with the existence status of snow falling. And so instantiation is built into the content as represented in 12. So accordingly, merely contemplating the possibility of snow falling can be captured as in 13, snow falling now possibility. That's what's going on in the subject's head. A second kind of complication arises because we can wonder about many things, including whether or not something is possible at all. So we can wonder whether or not time travel is possible. So since the original analysis of wondering already involves possibility, the time travel example will involve a double possibility content, because the subject will wonder about the possibility of a possibility. So this can be represented as time travel possibility, possibility of instantiation. And then this will be able to be distinguished from believing that time travel is possible, because you will have already come down on the status of the possibility. Yes, it's a real possibility. It's a live one. And so that can be represented as time travel possibility instantiation. So that's what that is doing there in 15, that instantiation bit. Okay, so now desire. Desire is also very complicated, as we all, I'm sure, are aware. But suppose that we take it that desire essentially involves a pro attitude towards the possible instantiation of a certain property or properties. Thus, a desire for it to snow involves a commitment to the goodness of snow falling. So substituting in the general form CA, we get snow falling now good. But of course, this simple analysis won't be enough to capture the full content of desire, because it leaves out the idea that the world may fall short, unfortunately, of many of our desires. But this is easily fixed by building into the content of certain desires that the way one wants the world to be is not the way that it currently is. So you could have something like desiring that snowfall might be snow falling now good, world not that way, better if it were. And I'll just mention that there are further complications with desire because we can desire things that we don't like and like things we don't desire. And so I think that, the analysis of desire will need to be complicated. But I think that for those cases of, like you desire drugs, but you don't like them, that's a really, that you don't like the drug anymore. That's a really good case of how those two things come apart. And Richard Holton has some interesting work, and there's been some interesting work on addiction. But I think we might be able to take care of these with all is equal clauses. So finally, emotion. So I take emotion to be very similar to desire. In fact, I think desire is probably some type of emotion, but emotion essentially involves pro and con attitudes. So they will receive similar analyses to desire. So for example, fearing a snake may be represented as snake, danger, bad, something like that. So again, the idea of the dual view is very simple. So in each case of these intentional states, there is something distinctive about its content alone, which is sufficient to distinguish it from other intentional states. In describing states of belief, contemplate, wonder, and desire in this way, there's no need to appeal to anything over and above the overall content of the states as typically understood in order to make the distinctions that are standardly made by reference to the attitudes. And they all have the metaphysical structure pictured by CA. And so the idea is it's just simply unnecessary to appeal to a belief relation, a contemplation relation, a desire relation, and so on. So that's the plug for the dual view and how I think these analyses would go. So I just want to, for the final section of this paper, I want to return to the motivations for the tripartite view and tell you what I think the dual view has to say to them. So the motivations 1, 2, and 3 for the tripartite view are all closely related. So there's reason to think that attitude and content are modally independent. That was 1. It's this modal independence of content that seems to allow for the intersubstitutability needed to capture intuitively valid inferences, such as Stacy believes England will win the Ashes. George wants England to win the Ashes. So Stacy believes exactly what George wants. And it's inferences of this sort that are so central to our everyday folk psychological explanations and predictions of behavior. So as a start, a reply to these 3 interrelated motivations begins by pointing out that once the full intentional content of beliefs and desires is explicitly and fully spelt out, we see that beliefs and desires can't, in fact, have exactly the same content. So with respect to the winning the Ashes example, for believing, we have Stacy having the content, England winning Ashes instantiation. George, however, desiring, we have the content, England winning Ashes good. So we don't get, sort of the similar content for those inferences, but that's not to say that we can't recover by abstraction common factors among the contents which explain the intuitive appeal of these examples. They both, Stacy's and George's belief desire concern the Ashes. So there's an abstraction process that goes on in articulating and codifying these inferences, but that doesn't mean that that's how they're actually occurring in our head as we have these intentional states and as they stream past through whatever our minds. So this kind of abstraction process gives us a clue as to how the attitude content distinction arose in our language for categorizing intentional states and thereby became inscribed in folk psychology. So suppose one wants to introduce some sort of taxonomic order in the field of intentional mental phenomena by classifying mental states. In that case, the best candidates for being the highest genre of mental states may be things like states with instantiation content, states with possibility content, states with goodness content. One may then come up with names for these types of content: belief, wonder, desire. Just think of how much easier names make things, to talk about things. And that clauses may then be used to further specify which particular mental state we wish to talk about. In this way, the attitude-content distinction is written into folk psychology because of its profound usefulness in attempting to understand each other. For all this convenience, however, the deep psychological reality is that there is no metaphysical divide between attitudes and content. Really, there are only just different kinds of content. There are subjects in mental states, and those mental states have interesting and complicated content, and that metaphysically is all. Now, motivation 4 wanted to argue that because different intentional states have distinct causal functional profiles, that would give us reason to individuate different attitude types. The dual view accepts the commonalities and differences among these causal functional profiles, but denies that it implies a tripartite view. Certainly, all belief states share a causal functional profile, but that's because they share a certain kind of content, this instantiation content. So too, desires all share a certain kind of causal functional profile. Well, that's because they too share a certain kind of content, this goodness content. So in my mind, the order of explanation is that the relevant differences between these contents actually explains why these states have the causal functional profiles they do. I mean, what other answer can we give? Okay. Motivation 5 was the directions of fit idea that we needed to postulate attitudes to explain the different ways that our mind relates to the world. But once we see what the actual content of beliefs and desires are, we don't need to postulate an attitude in addition to explain how our minds relate to the world. The content can do that job. So in the case of belief, we have, in the case of 9, snow falling now, instantiation. That content captures how the mind is relating to the world, and desires has a different kind of content. So once we have what we need in the content, we no longer need to say, oh yeah, and in addition to the content, there are these metaphysical relations called attitudes. So we don't need that. And so motivation 6 is going to receive just a similar reply that the directions of fit idea received, because it too thought, oh, well, we need attitudes to explain the different way that content can be evaluated. And so once you get all of the content packed in to the intentional state, we no longer need to have reason to postulate attitudes. So so in conclusion, I've tried to show that how there's no fundamental metaphysical distinction between attitudes and content, that all the distinctions that we want to make between intentional states can be done once we look at the richness of the content in our intentional states. And I've tried to leave the issue of consciousness to the side and not really discuss it much in articulating or arguing for the dual view. But again, in the background, I have a lot going on in the background that's not making it into the paper, but in the background, I think that the dual view with its kind of phenomenology is much more in harmony with the metaphysics, because when I think about how intentional states occur in my mind, I don't find a belief relation. I don't find that item there. I find a subject and I have content streaming through my mind. So if that's how the phenomenology appears to me, and so if that's correct, then the dual view brings into harmony the phenomenology and the metaphysics, because all we have are subjects and contents. So that's the end.
Thank you very much, Michelle. So do you want to start the Q&A right away, or would you like a minute or two for a break?
Maybe I'll just take 1 minute and
Okay.
yeah, I'll just use.
And in the meantime, so people already started writing their names on the chat box for their questions. So if you have a question, just write your name or question in the chat box, and I'll make a list. And I'll follow my list, not necessarily the same as it might appear to you, although I've tried to stick to that. And we will start when Michelle is back.
Okay.
Hi.
Hi.
Okay, so I have the list of questions here. So if you're okay, we can start with Robert's question. Yeah.
Okay, my question's related to the discussion that you had about dogs being able to have the concept of instantiation. Not exactly, but one might think that there's my worries about over-intellectualizing. In particular, what about the possibility of non-conceptual contents and perhaps even non-conceptual beliefs? Is that excluded by your view?
I think there can be non-conceptual content. So if specifically you might think that that occurs in perception, but I think that, yeah, I'm not sure what a non-conceptual belief would be, like a wholly non-conceptual belief. Do you have something in mind or an example?
Well, it would be hard to express it if it's non-conceptual. But I take it if you think that think about beliefs as leading to dispositions to behave or something like that, there might be a possibility of there being non-conceptual belief that will lead to one having those dispositions, or that would be expressed by one having those dispositions.
Yeah, I think that even if it's dispositional, you would have to have concepts. So if I had a dispositional belief that Obama had 2 lungs, even if that were dispositional, I would have to possess those concepts to have the belief, even if they weren't being deployed because they were dispositional.
Well, what about simpler beliefs, like the disposition to believe that there's food in front of you? You suggested that dogs might have beliefs.
Yeah.
Belief that a dog has could be something like there's food or water available, but it might not be. It's not clear to me that it would have to have the concept of food or water in order to have a belief in those cases.
I think, I mean, they certainly wouldn't have the kind of water concept that we have. But you might want to say that they have a more minimal concept or something like that. But even if, sort of, I don't want to get, even if, no matter how we sort of try to figure out what a concept is and what it is to possess it and what's the minimal conditions of possessing a concept, I do think a dog can think this is so, this exists. And so I think that's all I would need.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Robert. I think Giovanni is next.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for the talk. This is about, so I'm just trying to get clear to the extent to which we need to see the dual view as an alternative to the tripartite view, especially in the light of what you say on the last page of the handout about the kind of abstraction process that we can perform on the things that the dual view gives us. So we can perform this abstraction process in such a way that given a description of what a subject is like when he, say, believes that water is wet, we can also abstract a relation, if we want, that the subject shares with other subjects that believe other things, the relation of believing. We can also abstract a propositional content that the water is wet, other subjects are related to in other ways when they wish that the water is wet, or hope that the water, or desire that the water is wet, and so on and so forth. So we can do all that, and I'm wondering, if we can do all that, why is the tripartite view false? What more than the viability of this abstraction process is required for the tripartite view to be true? It seems, I mean, there's at least an alternative view of what you're doing on which we can say, oh, you know, there's one state of affairs there of Mary believing that water is wet. You can analyze that in the way the tripartite view recommends, or you can analyze that in the way the dual view recommends. And maybe, you know, we can have an argument about which of these two analyses is more fundamental than the other, which one is more useful for which purposes. But we don't really need to say this is how things are and this is not how things are. Both are. I mean, as far as what you said today goes, it seems that both are on the table, and we shouldn't really choose one over the other. So
I wouldn't. First of all, I wouldn't describe the abstraction process as abstracting a belief relation. That's not what was abstracted. It was a piece of content that was abstracted, that was then given a name. That's what. But to answer your other question, well, the dual view has simplicity on its side, metaphysical simplicity. So if we can adequately describe the metaphysics of the situation, which I didn't, argue, is supported by how these mental states actually occur in our conscious stream. If we can adequately describe them just in terms of subjects and content, there's no need to introduce a metaphysical relation. It's metaphysically superfluous. And that's one argument for choosing the dual view over the tripartite. So they are not the same. They are different metaphysically.
Sorry, but the kind of complexity that the tripartite view describes by appealing to different relations, believing, desires, that complexity reappears in your view as a constituent of the kind of contents that you appeal to, because these things, instantiation, good, possibility that you use, of course, they have no parallel in the tripartite view. So the kind of simplicity that we achieve on one side, we lose on the other side. So it's unclear that in terms of simplicity, there is a clear win of the dual view over the tripartite view.
There is a clear win for the dual view because the tripartite view has a multiplicity of kinds. So they're saying, look, there are two kinds. We need two kinds of things, kinds to analyze. We need a relation and we need the content. And the dual view is saying, no, we only need content. So we only need this one kind of thing. So that's really the kind of simplicity that matters. So yes, you have mental states that have this content that's complex, but that's content. You only have one kind of thing. So it's not even with respect to simplicity.
Can I have a last comeback, Umut? Or
yeah, go on. Yeah.
I mean, suppose changing subject for a second, suppose we have the state of affairs of John loving Mary. John loves Mary. And then there are two people arguing about how to analyze that. And there's one character that says, oh, there's a relation of loving, and there are two subjects that he relates, John and Mary. And then there's another character that comes around, no, there's a monadic property which John instantiates, which is the property of loving Mary. And then someone were to argue for the monadic view by saying, oh, on my view, there's just one thing, monadic properties. Whereas on your view, there are monadic properties plus relations. Would you regard that as an argument in favor of the monadic view? Because it seems to me that well, there is no real gain there. Yes, in one sense, there is one kind of thing, but we know how we know why an analysis that appeals to relations is, for many purposes, important, convenient, unavoidable, and all that.
Well, unavoidable is a strong claim, but no, I do regard that as an argument. I mean, that's Occam's razor. I mean, it's a standard way of trying to decide between two ontological theories.
Right. Thanks.
Actually, I have my question could be a follow-up to Giovanni's question. So I'm going to remove myself from the list, and I'll just ask my question here. So in response to Giovanni, you said that one cost to the tripartite view is the sort of the multiplicity of kinds of these intentional relations, which is probably true, but could probably be overcome by depending on how you implement the tripartite view. I was thinking about, because you quoted Fodor, suppose you have a view like Fodor's, language of thought, the sort of the original sort of 1975 type of view, where actually the multiplicity of these relations can all be sort of analyzed in terms of one kind of thing, after all, which is basically sort of a causal role or functional role of certain representations to certain things causally, and that is what distinguishes belief from desire or something like that. I mean, that kind of multiplicity of different kinds of relations could be kind of eliminated in terms of going with a slightly sort of reductionist type of attitude, I wondered.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. You still have, I mean, it is, what's the reality of the relation being posited here? And so it seems to me what you want to do is to get rid of it by, well, you kind of want to replace it with a causal relation. So
I don't want that. I'm just saying somebody might.
Yeah. So you have different types of causal relations, right? So, you have one kind of causal relation going for belief, and different kinds of, sort of, because it can't, it can't be quite as uniform as causal relation, can it? Because it has to be specified in more detail, because it's what's distinguishing beliefs or desires. So it can't be causal relation on its own.
I mean, it's the causal relation. I mean, it's a role that a representation plays in the overall cognitive economy or whatever, and behavior of the organism. So it might be as,
So you have role 1, role 2, role 3, role 4.
But fundamentally, they are not really, I mean, on this picture, they are not really, really different. They are still sort of the, general. I don't know how to.
Yeah, it's an interesting
role
question.
Type phi or something.
What's that?
Role of type phi or something.
Yeah.
But I mean, the idea is that they are not going to be like sui generis to each other. They're going to be similar to each other in important ways. That's, after all, sort of the roles that representations play in human behavior. And but again, I'm not defending this option. I'm just saying how the tripartite, one version of tripartite view might sort of.
Yeah, I do wonder if that's really getting away from this, very far away from the, how he described it as a relation, right? Because now you've got roles that are typed by what role they play, and they are distinct from one another. Now, you might think, okay, but they're all causal, so that makes them all one, but not quite, because they have different roles. So I think the metaphysics is kind of tricky here. But one thing is that you still have now two types of things in terms of which you're analyzing the intentional state, the role and the content. So you might think that's still more complicated, but it is an interesting way of thinking about the question, the ontological parsimony question.
Yeah, I mean, so the other issue is obviously, I mean, something that Giovanni already said. I mean, the kind of multiplicity comes in the content, in your view, as well as in, sort of, these are, after all, different contents in your view. But yeah, I get that, role and content are going to be different. Anyway, I don't want to take more of your time, because I think there are the fingers in this. Sorry, yeah, go on.
I do just want to repeat that but the content, it's all content. It's all one kind of thing. So we already have lots of different kinds of content. green, red. And so you're not really introducing a different type of thing by saying, oh, and there's some instantiation content too. You've already got content. So it's still more parsimonious.
Okay. There are a few fingers on the same question. So Alex.
I'm happy to, so I think Anita had a finger. I'm happy to just incorporate my comment into my question because I was next anyway.
Okay, Anita, do you want to
yeah, I'm just going to push this a little bit more if that's okay.
Anita, where are you? Okay, there you are. Sorry, I had to find you.
So I'm just trying to, because there are a couple of times when it sort of sounded tripartite to me, and I was trying to get a grip on where it sounded a little tripartite, even though I could see what you were trying to do. And I just want to convince myself that you can't squeeze out a tripartite here. So I guess I was thinking, well, at one point I summed it up in my head by saying, okay, so you want to separate an attitude towards a content towards, as opposed to something like a way of having a content. But as soon as I said that, I thought, well, a way of having a content kind of shades into an attitude towards the content. You could have it shade into an attitude towards the content. So I was just wondering how you could characterize it so that it really looks distinct. So that's just one part of it, of what I wanted to ask. Should I stop there for a second?
Yeah, let's stop there, because I don't think I described it as a way of having.
No, you didn't. I did in my head. And
and I think that is a sort of how it's natural to think of it in terms of how it's natural to think of perceptions. So I think that's why manners of representation, that's more like a way of having a representation, is more natural than saying perceptual attitude. I think that's why that terminology kind of got in there. But yeah, so I want to, no, it's not, there's not ways of having content. There's just the subject, and then there's the content. That's what I want to argue for.
So it's actually got, see, what we have to understand is how it is that the content, sorry, I'm just trying to think, we're looking for an example of your content, so I can remind myself. Snow falling now, instantiation. I'm not convinced that the content, it includes a way of being had, but the way of being had can't be separated out from the content. That's what you want to say.
I don't want to say that I don't want to say that there's a way of having the content.
Yeah.
And you're saying that's a natural way to express what's happening?
Yeah, I'm trying to get a grip on how to understand these contents such that they're not including ways of.
Yeah.
Because you wanted to capture phenomenology, don't you? That's why you're going to the dual view, right?
Well, yeah, actually, really, part of what got me thinking about this was, what are these belief relations? Where, do I have them in my mind? They don't seem to be there. These desire, I didn't want to turn the whole argument on it, but that's sort of what's happening in the background for me, like stuff like that in metaphysics and how we should understand the metaphysics of consciousness. But yeah, that was sort of a motivator for me to think about this question.
But it's convenient for you, given your views, isn't it, that when you start to think about the phenomenology, it ends up supporting the phenomenology of intentionality.
It all comes together. It's very convenient. It looks very convenient with respect to perception. Like it looks sort of what I say about, but Anita, when I was forming those views, I never thought of it as a way of getting rid of the relations. And so when I was looking at the relationship between phenomenology and intentionality, I was really focused a lot on content, even for belief states and thinking. And I just kind of left the attitude hanging there, and I was really just focused on content. But then I thought, wait, what are these belief relations? I don't seem to find them in my mind. And then when you look at perception, it looks, sort of very good for given my views on phenomenology and intentionality. It's very natural.
Yeah.
And then, but then, getting rid of like beliefs and desires was a different sort of, I had to do more things. It didn't just fall out of how I think about cognitive phenomenology and intentional it didn't just fall out of there. But I was just also sort of thinking about how complex our intentional states are as they actually occur. And that sort of gave me some hint that I might look towards the content to see if I could do away with belief relations by looking at the complexity of content. That's kind of how it happened for me.
Yeah, I agree that the way you structured the paper so that the perceptual case came first was a good softener.
Yeah, that's right. It is.
It worked. Okay, thanks. I'll just stop.
Thanks, Anita.
So, because Alex's question was going to be connected, I wonder if we get Alex's question, and Giovanni, we can add you as a finger to Alex's question. Would that be okay?
Great.
Alex, do you want to go next?
Yeah, that works. So I had a few things to say, but I think Giovanni, the first thing I say, you can then come in with as a finger. It should all connect. The finger I was going to raise before was just, Giovanni had this point about, compared two views. One involves a relation, one, A, R, B. One just has A instantiating a monadic property, and is the one view better than the other? And I think Michelle, your reply was, well, yeah, because from parsimony point of view, you've got, the monadic property instead of a relation and so on. And I'm kind of thinking, as a rule, that gives you what people call quantitative parsimony, right? You get, because relations and properties are really the same kind of thing, it doesn't give you the more interesting qualitative parsimony that one would need to justify a decent Occam's razor argument. And so I just thought,
wait,
so
why do you think relations and properties are the same thing?
The same sort of thing in the sense that relations are really just properties are just one place. Relations, or put differently, relations are just many place. Propositions are zero place properties.
Yeah, I don't know if why were people so vexed about relations then? What was are there vexed. Relations? Russell was very bothered, Wittgenstein was bothered.
But I don't think they were, another way, they're all, if relations are universals, so are one place properties, and if they're, it's not like if you discovered that relations were outside space and time, you could then say that properties were in it. They're the same kind of thing in that the theorizing is going to, so I understand one can then push back in the ways you've just said, but I think without getting too much into it, since this was just a finger, I think the reasons that people have had to worry about relations don't tell in favor of thinking that relations are different kinds of thing to properties in the relevant sense. But that was just my comment. But yeah, and that's the comment I suspect Giovanni may want to come in on, and that perhaps Galen has a finger on. But may I just run through my other stuff while I have my turn? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So I'll just go in order, and then if you want to sort of stop me as and when it suits you, that's fine. I don't intend to take forever, despite the way it might sound.
Can I just stop you again? Because I'm confused about why you think people were bothered by relations.
Yeah, okay.
They do generate different problems and properties. So Bradley's regress was a problem about relations, and relations were weird. Like people were, what are these?
Okay,
things?
Good.
Yeah, so I don't think that.
So Bradley's regress, as I understood it, was actually a problem about instantiation. If you think it's a relation, and the conclusion is it's not a relation, it can't be. But relations as such are okay. Bradley's regress is just, look, if you treat instantiation.
I know what it is. Yeah.
No, sorry, I didn't mean.
That's okay.
Otherwise, of course you do. But so people aren't. I don't see that as people being bothered about relations per se. They're just worried about what happens if you treat instantiation as a relation, as surface grammar would suggest that it is.
I don't. I'm sort of racking my brains about Russell too, because I don't think Russell was worried about instantiation. Sort of thinking, oh, are relations puzzling? Oh, it's only instantiation. If we could just get rid of the instantiation relation, then we'd be okay with relations. I think Russell was concerned about the existence of relations for other reasons, not just that. So I don't know. I would have to look more carefully, but I don't.
Sorry. There's a
Okay.
lag. So
That's
maybe
okay.
one thing to think through then is maybe there's an argument of this form. There's a way of thinking about puzzles that relations generate, but that properties don't, which would point towards a difference in kind of the sort you would need for the kind of qualitative parsimony you need.
Right.
But that's the structure it would have to take. Maybe that's what comes out of this. Okay, cool. So I was thinking at first, when you were characterizing the standard kind of tripartite view, I was thinking one standard part of that standard view is that contents are propositions. Now, in which case, if you're operating with the same notion of content as the standard tripartite view, when you represent it as CA, which looks like the instantiation of a property by A, it looks like contents on the one hand are supposed to be propositions if they're the standard sorts of things we were talking about, or we suddenly shift and they become complex properties. Now, don't get me wrong, there's room for a view on which contents are complex properties. But now I'm wondering two things. So dialectically, is this shift okay? Like, because your opponents were treating, a bunch of them anyway, were treating contents as propositions. So is it okay for you to shift suddenly to treating them as complex properties? And two, is that actually what you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, that part of how to actually treat content, I think the metaphysics is up in the air. So I guess the CA could be a proposition. Obviously.
Well, CA itself could be, but my question is C. So if C is a proposition, it's metaphysically independent from A, and something has to connect it to A, and it can't be instantiation if C is a proposition.
Right. Good. Yeah. So I hadn't thought. I mean, I was sort of moving away in thinking of consciousness not in terms of properties, but in terms of stuff. And so. I mean, that's working in the background for me. And so I haven't really figured that out.
So there's this nice, but just on that note, Tim Crane has this nice paper, The Given, in 2013, where he starts to think of content in a kind of stuff or concrete way, as he puts it, which might connect up with some of that.
Yeah.
But my comment here, though, is just that it does seem like, given the CA form of symbolism, it looks like you're thinking of contents as complex properties in the sort of way that Adam Pautz is inclined to do. So here's another direction you might go in. Adam Pautz is, in some of his work, I could email you later with the things I'm thinking of. I think there's a 2007 paper on like intentionalism and perceptual presence. But he seems to basically say that thinking of contents as propositions and thinking of them as complex properties isn't metaphysically very deep difference-wise in the end. Now, if that move could be sustained, then you might say, and then this is relevant to the dialectical thing I mentioned at first, then maybe the view you end up with, if indeed it's a property, contents or properties views, might not be that different from contents or propositions as your opponents originally thought, and that might help you out.
Yeah, right. Good. Thanks.
On the other hand, here's my worry about Adam's view. It looks to me like one thing content was meant to do is be the sort of thing that can say of the world that it's a certain way. So Hillary Putnam somewhere has got this quote like, if perception is representational, it speaks. Almost joking, right? And the thought is, and when I explain it to students, I say, look, propositions say the world's a certain way. And when I stand in the belief relation to that proposition, I have a mental state which thereby says of the world that it's that way. Now, I don't quite see how properties say of the world that it's any certain way, because they're not that clauses. They're not expressible by that clauses.
Well, you could have, you could have different theories of representation too. I mean, it could be that there could be some sort of structural resemblance between the complex property and the way that the world is. And I mean, I know that would come with its own special problems, but that would be a deep question about whether or not we can think of ways of thinking about representation that are alternative to, or the ways in which a complex property view can But yeah, that's interesting.
And then like just two things on that score is that, so one is that one has to be careful about the kinds of things that can be content. So you don't want green or red being contents, because the subject probably won't be green or red.
Yeah.
When when instantiating the relevant content.
Or they could be.
Yeah, but but
yeah.
not as such, and not necessarily. And then more generally, and another issue with Adam kind of happily moving from the propositions to complex properties, as if they're not different views. Well, it looks to me like propositions expressing impossibilities are fine. So like there is a round square, that's a decent proposition that can exist.
Yeah.
But there's a complicated question about whether there can be impossible properties, whether the ontology should allow for those.
Yeah.
And now, given that, we do need contents to involve, impossible stuff, to say properly capture the waterfall illusion, or things like that, whether it's both moving and not moving. And so it looks like, so my argument is propositions but not properties can be impossible in the relevant way.
Why can't properties be combined in these ways that are sort of impossible for the world to be, but put them together any old way you want?
Yeah. So there is a view that, there is the property of being the round square. That's fine. But then I'm just saying that there's also there are reasons for worrying about such a view that don't come up for worrying about whether there are propositions of that sort. You might just think, I don't know, that does the world really contain properties of that kind that they're never instantiated? Armstrong's principle of instantiation, only the properties that are instantiable exist, is a well-motivated principle.
Yeah.
So that was that. And then my very final thing, and this connects up with your final comment. You said that the phenomenology lines up better with your view because the phenomenology, especially in perception, is really just of content, right? So one, that fits nicely with some stuff Tim wants to say in that paper I mentioned, so just FYI. But two, I'm thinking that, look, if thinking about perception, and I've got my kind of naive realist hat on here, but I think we're onto something. I think thinking about perception, like content doesn't come up either, especially not if they're propositions or complex properties of the right kind. Like what I get in perception when I open my eyes are trees and redness and the redness of the leaves on the trees. I don't get that the tree is such and so, or I don't get being such that there is a dog in front of me. And these are the kinds of properties or that one would need if content is a property. And
wait, so why? I mean, if you described your own experience involving redness, which is a property.
Good, but that is not the kind of property that could serve as a content for the very reason that you want it to be instantiable by the subject.
Sorry, I lost that last step. So
redness cannot be, so the kinds of properties themselves, redness, being a tree, being red, those things typically won't be instantiated by the subject, and therefore they cannot be the content on your view, because you want the content to be instantiated by the subject.
Oh, yeah, I think
the subject isn't a tree and might not be red.
I think that part of it is what you think redness is. So are you thinking redness is spread out there in the world and that you're somehow confronted with? No.
Whatever it is, I might not be, the subject might not be red right now, even though I'm seeing a red thing.
Yeah, I think that's a very tricky step, that I am not red, right? So
all right, I'm not a tree.
I think it depends. Well, sort of tree shaped, sort of a certain shape.
For me right now, it's
but we're talking about your mental states, not your body. Okay, we're talking about your experience.
So is A the subject or the mental state?
A is the subject, but it is in a certain mental state. So
my
the
thought was, if A is the subject, then C cannot be a property of a kind that the subject isn't guaranteed to have.
Why? I don't. I think
because I thought that C was being instantiated by the subject, by A.
So are the fingers going to be helpful in this respect, or is it...
Well, I'd just like to say one thing. I take it that all these things are inside the content, in the large sense of content, which is mental content in general, which is much wider than merely propositional content. So everything that you're worried about, whether the subject herself instantiated, are in the content that the subject instantiates entertaining. So I'm puzzled by that. I should add, though, that I actually do think the subject is read for Russellian reasons in the brain. And, it's been so long that it's thought to be a knockdown point that, experiences aren't read. Actually, it needs a lot of rethinking, but I'll leave that out because everybody will disagree. Does that help? So the subject doesn't have to be read, but the subject has the property of entertaining the content, and this redness is given in that content.
Yes, I'm worried that I'm taking up way too much time. All I was trying, I'm going to write this in a comment, because usually, Michelle, sometimes we sort of leave the comments for the person to take. So I've just written a note to everybody, and then I'm going to stop speaking. But the thought is really just that, like, if the content is just properties of a familiar sort, being a tree, being red, and if the thing instantiating the content, instantiating the properties, is the subject, then you don't want those to be properties of a sort that the subject typically doesn't have. That's all.
Okay, thanks. I will look at. Sorry.
Instantiates the property of currently entertaining the content with all that content.
That's fine. So complicate the property in such a way that the subject can have it, and we're good. That's fine. But then it doesn't fit.
That's what was intended. I don't know.
Good. So, but I agree. I think that is what was intended. But then I wanted to say that it doesn't seem like the phenomenology supports the involvement of such complex properties. The phenomenology supports the involvement of green, red, but it doesn't involve the complex thing Galen just said of entertaining the content such that.
You need some cognitive phenomenology. You need to think about the overall nature of what it is like to be seeing something. So
again, how did you put it, by the way? You said so the content would be some complex property like what being such that
whatever you're seeing now, and in
is
everything
going
about
on.
the way you're living it right now is part of the phenomenology of the experience, and therefore of the total content of the experience.
Yeah. So I want to say that it's absolutely fine for the subject to instantiate such properties. It's fine for you to call those properties contents. I doubt that mere appeal to phenomenology supports the existence of such properties in the same way as it supports the evident existence of things like redness and trees, being a tree.
May I propose moving on, just because we have still about 8 people on the queue.
Sorry, I took it. Sorry.
No, thanks, Alex.
Giovanni, do you still have a follow-up on this, if it's brief?
It's all right. I think we should move on.
Okay, cheers. Okay, Anandi is next.
Hi, thank you. That was a very interesting discussion. And I'm going to ask a kind of simpler, more detailed question. So I was just wondering if you could say more about the distinction between modal belief, so believing that something is possible, and wondering, because if you look at 12 and 15 on the handout, 12 is supposed to capture wondering, and that's snow falling now, possibility-based instantiation.
Yeah.
And if you look at 15, that's supposed to capture believing, and then you have time travel, possibility, instantiation. Is the whole distinction lying in the word of? And if so, what is that? What's the importance of that?
Yeah, it is. Well, when I was comparing 14 and 15, so there the of was doing, wait, now I've lost you. There you are. The of was doing work, because 1 in 14, yeah, so in 15, the possibility instantiation was just, you're sort of taking that possibility as being a live one, that time travel is possible. So that's what it was doing there.
And what about 12 then? Because that's supposed to be wondering.
Yeah, 12.
Now, I mean, ignoring that it's snow falling now, but it's a different.
Yeah, it's a different, because you're wondering about what's actually happening in 12. Like, is it snowing now in the world? But 15, you're wondering about a possibility, whether or not a possibility is actually possible. So is time travel possible? And somebody says yes, that doesn't mean that time travel is actual. Okay, that's not what you're wondering. That's in 15, that's not what you're believing. What you're believing is that there's a possibility that's a live one. Whereas somebody might say, no, actually time travel is not possible. So you're really just wondering about a possibility, whether or not it could be instantiated. What you just focus on the possibility, whereas in 12, when you're wondering if it's snowing, you're actually wondering about what's in, is that a possibility instantiated in the world right now? So you're sort of directed at different things. One, you're directed at kind of, in the wondering case, as I've spelled out, you're directed at, is that happening in the world now? Whereas when you're wondering about the time travel being possible, you're not sort of wondering, is that happening in the world now? You're concerned with a possibility.
So suppose I believe, suppose I believe that snow falling now is possible. I do actually.
Yeah.
It is possible. What is the property then? What is the, how would you analyze that?
So that would be a similar, you would just be wondering about a possibility. So you would say, yes, the possibility is a live one. So you have to stick on. Yeah.
Sorry, so that's the crux, I guess, of my question. So it seems like belief that snow falling now is possible and wondering whether snow falling now is possible get the same analysis. And those seem like two different states to me. Two different attitudes.
I don't know, actually. This is a really good question, because I've thought about this reiteration of possibilities, and I start losing, my grip about, whether or not there are, we are thinking of distinct states, whether they are actually distinct.
Well, I mean, so this, I guess there's another related case that I was thinking about, which is the distinction between believing that there's a 50% chance that P versus having a confidence of 0.5 that P. So that's another kind of case. It's sort of similar. So the sort of contemplating a possibility versus believing that something is possible. Those seem like different attitudes. And then also believing that something is likely and having a certain degree of confidence in that. Those seem like different things.
Yeah, the sort of the degree of confidence one, I'm not sure, because you might think, I think it depends on how you view those. So you might not think you can put numbers exactly. You might say high, low, medium, and that's going to be different from 50% chance. That would be one way of addressing that issue.
But I think it's not about the numbers. It doesn't matter how you model that exactly. It's just that there's a difference between having a full belief in a chance event versus having a certain degree of confidence in an event occurring, right? So it seems like it's going to be hard to make those kinds of distinctions on the kind of analysis that you're suggesting. Yeah. And I guess the same kind of worry is playing a role in the distinction between contemplating a possibility and believing that something is possible, in the same sense that those seem like two different attitudes. They might figure differently in my behavior, for example. So believing that something is possible might influence my behavior. It might figure in my decision making in a way that wondering whether contemplating a possibility just wouldn't. So if they're going to be given the same kind of analysis.
But I think contemplating whether something is possible and believing that it's possible are actually easily distinguishable, because when you're believing that something's possible, you've sort of taken a stand on that possibility, namely it's real. Okay, when you're just contemplating a possibility, you haven't taken a stand. So I think those are easily distinguishable. The wondering case, sometimes, depending on how you're using the word wondering, I think it can be less clear what's going on. But then I think it becomes less clear to say, oh, you're acting, wondering is different from believing in this case. So I think the contemplating believing case is clear that contemplating a possibility and believing a possibility are clearly different. And I think it's easy to distinguish those. Now, the sort of
just take up the wondering belief distinction.
Yeah. So what were you? So
My
wondering.
thought is that if you take what you say in 15 about your analysis of believing that time is possible, and you just ask, what would it be to believe that snow falling now is possible? And that it looks like just by parity, that would be snow falling now, possibility, instantiation, which is very much like 12, which was supposed to be wondering. So then I think
I do think the of is playing a role in 12, because you're wondering about the possibility, is it instantiated, whereas you're believing that snow falling is possible. You've already taken, again, a stand on the possibility. So I think the contents are different, and the of is playing a role there in making those contents different.
Okay.
Now your case with, you believe that there's a 50% chance of rain.
Yeah.
Versus I have a degree. So what's the content of the degree of confidence? What's the content of that?
Well, it's just P, right? It'll rain, and then I have a certain degree of confidence that it'll rain.
So what's the difference? So I say, okay, so is there a number you can put on that degree of confidence? Because you can just put sort of the degree of confidence into the content of that belief. So
yeah, you can, but I think that those two things are different.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what having beliefs about chances, having full beliefs about chances seems different from having a certain degree of confidence in a proposition, a non-chance.
So yeah, well, here's a go, sort of 50% chance of rain instantiation. Okay, so that would do. And then, so P, degree of confidence, high degree of confidence P. So, or medium degree of confidence. So what I'm going to resist is that you can put numbers on degree of confidence. So that now I've distinguished between those two kinds of states.
Okay. I mean, I could also think there's a high chance that it'll rain, but yeah.
Right.
There's a finger on this.
It's just a one-line thing, which is just on the possibility, on the wondering and believing thing. Like we were talking before about if you do think of contents as properties, right? It looks like maybe one way of putting Anandi's point is the property involved in both, which would be the content, in both the believing and the wondering case. It's going to be something like, possibly it's being such that it's possibly snowing. That's going to be the same property in both cases. And so you don't have a way of distinguishing believing from wondering, but someone who had the belief and the wondering relation easily would do. And so maybe this is further pressure on thinking of contents as properties, but we already know you can't think of them as propositions. And so, yeah, that's what I wanted to, I think that's in the ballpark of what Anandi was worried about.
Yeah, I'm not going to say anything different from what I just said to her about how to distinguish those.
No time in it. Yeah, just wanted to.
David is next.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Michelle. That was all great, and I'm keen on the general project. I'm persuaded of having more fine-grained contents and fewer attitudes. That seems a good way to go. And I've got a question really about the background, something you didn't talk about, but it's in the line of Alex's worries about what's in the C. What kind of property of A is that? But I wasn't so much worried about it having the shape of a proposition. I had a more immediate worry. So however you're thinking about it, you're clearly taking the C thingy to involve worldly properties and objects for that matter, like a tree or roundness or squareness or redness or so on. And I wasn't clear I was clear about what kind of relation I would have to those properties. I mean, it's not going to be instantiation, I take it. And you said you want to think about consciousness stuff. So once we're focusing on the consciousness stuff, it's not quite clear how the properties get in. And you talked about, I don't know, properties, observable properties in perception being immediately revealed and given. I was curious about that because it doesn't look like the conscious stuff it's not instantiating properties like redness and squareness, or maybe redness, but not squareness anyway. It's not instantiating it. So I was curious about whether you went down the line that, I mean, I presume you're not a naive realist, so it's being instantiated outside you. Huh? So there's the transparency people who think that in some sense, the property is literally in your consciousness, even though it's not instantiated. And I wondered whether you wanted to go that way. I mean, that would get the property in as something you're related to when you're perceiving. But then there's a problem, how's that going to work when we switch to other attitudes than perception? Because I don't know anybody who wants to, well, perhaps I'm ignorant, I mean, who thinks that in belief, when I believe with my eyes closed, that something is red and round in front of me. I mean, are those properties transparent in my belief? Are they literally part of my doxastic consciousness, even though nowhere instantiated around here? So I'm just curious about how you're thinking about how the properties get into the story.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm definitely not a naive realist. Mm-hmm. And when I think about perception, I'm sort of more and more drawn to a kind of neo-Kantian view. So these, properties like color and shape, and they actually are mental. Okay. Because they are the result of our causal interaction with something out there. Who knows what it is, even squareness. So I am more and more drawn to that. And I don't know how this fits into your picture of world. It depends what you mean by worldly items. That's why I think, people talk about mind independent properties that we're related to. And I think, I don't know about that.
Okay, no, I see how that goes, and it's becoming, in a way, familiar. I mean, curiously, Alex was giving a talk not from a phenomenal intentionalist or representationalist point of view just 2 days ago. And
sorry?
I think Alex Moran over there. Oh. And it turned out that he wanted to say that shape as we experience it, maybe as we think of it, is somehow mental.
Yeah.
And Uriah Kriegel's pretty explicit that what gets represented in perception, certainly, and probably more generally, are always response-dependent properties. So he becomes a kind of, I mean, it is very Kantian.
Yeah.
Everything we're perceiving and thinking are, in fact, the dispositions or whatever out there to produce certain responses in us. I mean, no, if you go that way, that makes sense. I mean, I must say, I don't find it very attractive.
I mean, I make the shape properties qualitative, not mental, but and therefore analogous to mental qualitative properties. Okay, so yes.
Take your name in vain.
No, I liked everything else. Thank you, David.
Fine, and I'm not ready to argue against that kind of global Kantianism right now. So it's just interesting to have it on the table.
Yeah. I certainly am not, haven't argued for it right now either, but I am drawn to it more and more, and so.
Good.
Next question is from Vince, but just before that, I just want to note that there's a question from the live stream audience. I put that in the chat box. We can come back to that later if we have time. It is also related to response-dependent properties, but if we have time, we'll come to that. Vince.
Hi. Thank you for a wonderful talk. Mine is hopefully a pretty quick clarification question, also relates, I think, to some of the other questions being asked. But imagine that I'm engrossed in a movie. It's a really good movie, and there's this character on the screen that's in trouble. And so phenomenologically, my experience is maybe described as worried about another person, Vince, in your language, right? I think that would make sense in your language. And this movie is so good that, again, that experience is basically the same as if I saw a person in real life on the street in trouble. And so from the perspective of the phenomenology, maybe that's all there's to it. But still, in any common usage of the word, nobody would say that when I'm watching the movie, I really believe that somebody is in trouble, right? And the reason that we wouldn't say that maybe is that even though it's not really in consciousness right now, very close to the surface, I still have this belief that I'm just watching a movie. And so I'm not actually really going to take any action to try to help this person. So I was wondering if, right, so when we talk about things like beliefs, I would think that a lot of the things that we say people believe aren't at that moment in their current experience, right? So does it make sense to talk about belief purely based on phenomenology, or do we have lots of kind of background subconscious beliefs that we normally talk about as well, but that you can't really pull out of the phenomenology?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting case of the movie example, because I wonder if actually your phenomenology, I mean, I think I would say that your phenomenology is actually different. There's a lot of similarity, and that's why we love the movies and love roller coasters or whatever. There's a lot of similarity, but those background beliefs, I would say, are sort of, they might not be fully in your phenomenology, but they might be impacting it in some way such that there is a difference. I would try to go that direction in answering that question.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Anita, you're next.
No, I already had...
Your finger covered your question. Okay, cool. Dom.
Hey, Michelle.
Hi, Dom. I can't see you, but wait, there
sorry.
you are.
I just had inconsistent internet, so if I freeze, that's why. So my question's about what you think the explanatory role of content is supposed to be, right? So at the moment, you're sort of shoving extra stuff in with willful abandon, more or less. So you acknowledge that, oh, well, maybe this would impose constraints on grasp, but beyond that, it's not so clear, because and the reason this might be pressing is that when you return to the motivations for the tripartite role, you very quickly say, oh, well, but we'd be abstracting the content which matters for these explanations. And then it's sort of very natural to say, well, if you're going to be doing that, then you're going to be, in effect, resurrecting the tripartite view as at a higher level. Yeah, it's going to be reducing to your stuff. Then it's sort of unclear. Then you've got sort of content playing an explanatory role at this higher level, right, which is the usual one, whatever that amounts to. And then it's sort of unclear what this broader notion of content is supposed to be doing for you, other than being just a repository for this additional stuff that you want because you want simplicity. But you might think, well, simplicity is not the only theoretical virtue, right? It only applies when you have equal explanatoriness, and what you've potentially introduced is a notion of content which is explanatorily redundant, right? Because why even call it content at that point? Like you could have said, look, at this bottom level, there's no content. There's just a bunch of junk there. And out of it arises this relational stuff. But the junk is simple, right? So simple, right? So you could have just said, oh, there's just this primitive property, P, that you instantiate. And when you've got P, then out of that arises these relational facts. But the relational facts are not basic. So the metaphysics doesn't, in some sense, they're for free. Right.
The explanatory role, what the explanatory role of content is a big question, because I think, for me, I start with, well, what is content? What is that even? What are we asking? And I think I start from a consciousness kind of first position and say, well, what content is everything that's given to you in an experience, everything that you're aware of and having an experience. Okay. So in trying to get a handle on what it is, content is, I start there. And that's I don't care about the explanatory role of content. Okay, so
then why I think that has anything to do with mental, like with this propositional attitudes, in fact, right?
Well, because I think propositional attitudes, I mean, I think beliefs and desires occur in our conscious stream. They are things that occur in our conscious stream, so they would, fall under that. Now, that's not to say there isn't some role for truth conditions and adequacy conditions that people talk about when they talk about content. It's just not all there is to it. So when I think about how are we going to get a grip on the notion of content, I start with conscious experience and what we're given in conscious experience, what we're aware of. That's content. Okay, so that's why trying to look at how beliefs actually occur in the conscious stream is an interesting question to me. What is it like to have a belief? Now, in the abstraction process, it can be, you might think it can be useful to be able to represent these inferences. And that's why you might abstract certain pieces of content and give them names. And then you can have, sort of represent these inferences more readily because now you have a division between attitude and content. I mean, I take it that that's part of what why do we care about folk psychology, right? We think that it explains behavior. But I actually, so I have nothing deep to say about this, but I don't really have that much confidence about the adequacy of folk psychology to actually describe what's going on in our minds when we make decisions or make predictions about people, that, what's actually happening. And so I'm a little skeptical that this abstraction process is actually revealing a reality that occurs in our minds. It could be useful for other purposes. But I don't know what to say in more detail about what goes on in our minds when we make decisions. I think it's probably a mess. And I'm sort of, what I'm doing in response to you is trying to question how useful folk psychology actually is in describing a reality that we live. And so even though it's possible and it's probably useful for doing logic and various things to be able to represent inferences, I don't know in this context how much reality it is revealing about our actual mental lives.
Okay, so then can I follow up very quickly on that, or are we running out of time?
No, it's okay.
Yeah, so I take that. I mean, I don't want to be an imperialist about the word content,
yeah,
right? Because that's not very useful. It's more that it's once you disambiguate, right? Like you've got people talking about content to mean this restricted thing of something truth valuable or whatever, and then you've got content and you're sort of the stuff we hit in our conscious lives, right? Then it's not clear sort of why you can't just say to the tripartite people, oh, look, what you hit in consciousness is not exhausted by propositions, right? And then, but insofar as you're just restricting attention to propositions for bookkeeping purposes, you're going to distinguish your little proposition, you're going to distinguish this other marker, right? So you sort of model the tripartite view.
Yeah.
And then it's just, then I sort of lose a grip on what the deep concern is, in effect, which I know is not fair because that's my confusion. But
no.
Right, I think because once it's pulled apart, because when it was all sort of one thing you were talking about, but okay, there's a disagreement about the explanatory role of content. But now, if we're just talking, if those things are different, then I don't see what the worry is.
Well, my concern about this originally was the metaphysics of intentional states. What's the actual metaphysics? And the two views give different metaphysical pictures.
Do they? I mean, neither one's going to, I mean, I don't know, but like someone who's a propositional attitude, a traditional propositional attitude person isn't going to say that they're attitudes to propositions at the level of physics, right? So
That
everyone's
what? I'm
reducing
sorry.
stuff. No one's going to say that there are attitudes to propositions at the level of fundamental physics, right? So these aren't basic constituents in reality. And so as long as they can be reconstructed, these relations within your framework, they'll just say, oh yeah, so you're just adding another sandwich layer below the layer we were talking about.
Yeah, I don't really, I mean, I don't think you can reduce mental, I don't think you can reduce mental life to the language of physics.
Oh yeah, no, that wasn't my, I didn't mean that, I just made.
So if somebody says, look, it's all, reducible to the language of physics, who cares? Right? I mean, that's sort of what seems like you're saying, like, who cares what, what's happening? None of these terms are going to show up in the end. And it's just going to be some complicated physical description.
Well, no, so it's more that you can allow that there are just multiple levels, and at each level there are going to be distinctions. And so as long as, there's like a folk psychology person who's going to say, yeah, there's a metaphysical distinction between attitude and content. It's not ultimately basic. And now we're just disagreeing about how many layers below it are. Right. And you're saying, oh, well, there's a layer below it, which is this content in this sense, the stuff that shows up in consciousness. Oh, and people haven't sort of realized that. Well, it's sort of, then the problem isn't about the tripartite analysis. It's about maybe some implicit assumption about where it fit in the hierarchy.
Yeah, I mean,
and if that's the disagreement, then
if
it seems like a different disagreement.
If somebody wants to say that, that's fine. Like, oh yeah, I was just talking about this superficial level, and at the superficial level, here we have these distinctions. But oh yeah, you're right, that's not the basic level. And at the basic level, we don't have those distinctions. And I say, great, we agree. If that's the role but I take it that they wanted to say something stronger than that, as evidenced by the quotations, when they by Fodor and John Perry, for example. But if that's not what they mean, if they mean, oh, I'm just talking about this superficial.
Well, I think it's not about superficial. They're going to think it's explanatorily relevant. And I took those quotations to be that saying that for a certain kind of explanation, you've got to make this divide. That's all.
Yeah. So I'm questioning that move. That was the first discussion we had. Like, I'm not so sure about that move. But then you moved to, oh, but metaphysically it's superficial. If they want to say that, then we agree.
Yeah. All right. I mean, we could keep going, but there's more.
Well, we have actually a couple other people on the actual queue.
Thanks.
So Giovanni, sorry, it's just we have about 5 minutes and at least 2 people who haven't asked their questions yet. So Barbara, do you want to go next?
Hi, Barbara.
Good to see you. So I'm probably suffering from that terrible hijacking that Galen mentions in the chat, but okay, let me just say it anyway.
I haven't read the chat, so I can't do that. I can't do chat and talk.
Yeah. Okay, so I may be suffering from some problem, but okay, with belief, part of the content is the concept instantiation. But instantiation, when you describe it, it sounds like a belief. This is so. Well, and if it's a belief, then it needs another instantiation and so on and so forth. It seems that there would be a regress. So I guess I just want you to say why instantiation, this is so, is not an extra belief, which itself would need instantiation. Right. And, yeah.
I'm not sure. I don't know if I'm going to be able to. So I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to say anything. Maybe you could say more to me about why you think it's another belief. So if I say snow falling, instantiation, why does that mean it's another belief? Like, why do I have to, why if I just say no, it doesn't seem that way to me. It's just, you're already taking it that things are so, That's it. That's the end. You're not sort of having to.
Well, this is so. It seems like a belief. This is so. That's a belief I have. This is so. That's a belief.
But that's supposed to sort of capture what's happening. When you say snow falling instantiation, that's a species. It's sort of that's taking taking a form of this is so, like a particular form. So you're not. That's all I'm trying to do by introducing that phrase. I'm not trying to pack that in addition. Do you know what I mean? This is so is always a way of this is so. There's always, and now I've used Anita's phrase, which I didn't want to do, but that's how I was thinking of it, as a particular case of this is so, I guess.
Okay. Yeah, I think that makes sense. Yeah. One other question. So snow falling now, it seems that, well, there's more to a belief than just these concepts. Like, I mean, word order often matters. And,
right.
Yeah, right. So in that one, it doesn't matter, but in many of our beliefs, how the words are connected, what the order they come in, it forms a whole. The somehow whole belief is more than just the individual concepts.
Yeah. Yeah, there's the unity of, sort of that unity problem. I guess, for Wittgenstein, I don't know why I'm talking about Wittgenstein, but here goes. He was really concerned about, and many people have been, about sort of the unity of the proposition. And so how do the objects link together so that we're saying something rather than just having a list? And that's what, the function of a relation. But for him, a relation wasn't an extra item. It was somehow part of what an object was, that it could be combined with another object in a certain way. It was sort of internal to the, and I don't really have anything, I'm just thinking of him as an example of somebody who's driven by this problem. And I can't say that I understand exactly what he's talking about, but I'm sort of sympathetic to not wanting to postulate something over and above objects in order to unify them, right? So that was part of what led to Bradley's regress. But I don't know if he successfully gave us a way to understand how objects could be linked together in a way that didn't introduce these extra metaphysical items. I don't know, Barbara. I don't know, but I see that that's a really interesting question, and I don't.
What about just the word order? Can you account for, the difference between I have to read this book, I have this book to read?
Right.
And they're two different beliefs, but they're the same, made out of the same concept somehow.
Yeah. It's true. So you would, I think you would, I guess, have to look at how the words are functioning in the sentence as well, right? So not just a word, but is this functioning as a, and then you have the different grammatical categories. And so what you're bringing out, I think, is really cool, because it's, there's so much complexity involved in just the content itself. And I think that's true. And so how to capture all of that, I don't know, but.
You're making a start.
Yeah.
Okay,
so we are at time, but there's one more question from someone who hasn't asked their question. So if Michelle has a few more minutes,
sure.
Matthew, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, sure. Great. Thanks very much. Yeah, you may have covered this when you were talking about the motivations for the tripartite view, and I might have missed it, but it seems to me that one motivation would be to capture certain transitions from one mental state to another. So, for example, from wondering something to believing something, it seems that, I don't know, on my, I guess, phenomenal reflection, it seems like there's something that you want to say that that's the same after, before and after you make that transition, that whatever it was that I'm now believing is the same thing that I was previously wondering. It seems like that might be a motivation for positing a distinction between, an attitude towards a content, but a content is distinct because it has kind of a unity of its own, which can stay the same when the attitudes towards it change.
Yeah, that is another motivation, and I think it's in the full paper. And I mean, one thing that you said that was interesting, that I hadn't thought of putting it in that way, is the unity point. That there's a unity to this bit through the transition, and does that give us some reason to think that it's its own metaphysical little entity? So that's a really interesting way to put that point, because typically I would just say, well, there are things that can be in common between mental states. I don't deny that, and that's true. That's true of what you've just described. But the states themselves would still have different content. So I would say, yes, something remains the same. I don't have to deny that, but they still have different content. When you move from wondering to believing, the content shifts. But the unity point is a different point. So that's something to think about.
Great. That's helpful. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Matthew.
Mm-hmm.
Should we conclude here, and then if Michelle has a few more minutes after we officially conclude, maybe we have a couple more minutes.
Okay.
Okay. Let's thank Michelle for this wonderful talk.
Thank you for.
I'm gonna stop the live stream, and